So you, by the way, Sarah, before you go, once that meeting stops, you'll get the link. I don't have to email it to you of the recording.
Correct.
Okay. Cool.
Feeling?
That was it. All right, Stephen, how are you? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm up at the lake, so I'm, yeah, good.
Nice. Where's the lake house?
It's up in Derry, New Hampshire.
Awesome.
Nice.
I like it. Do you have good weather? Is it chilly or is it nice?
I think it's chilly. The lake looks really choppy, but it's nice and sunny.
Oh, good. Well, I will wait a couple more minutes before we start, just in case someone else pops in.
I don't know if you can see the lake while we're waiting.
Oh,
nice.
beautiful.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
No boats out there, but
Have there been?
there's very few. I don't think they're putting them in.
Yeah.
Not yet, anyway, right?
No.
Are the marinas even, are they considered?
I don't think so. I don't think, I think they're really discouraging against that sort of thing right now. Yeah.
You mean boating's not essential? I would
When it's
consider
July,
essential.
it will be. Yeah. All right, we'll give a couple more minutes and then we'll start. Can you both see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yes.
Perfect. All right, well, since it's getting recorded anyway, I like to be punctual, so let's just go ahead and get started. So there was a bunch of documents that we weren't able to get to the last time. So Stephen, I know you weren't in that last session. I don't know if you watched the video or not, but we just basically went over really in detail the contract to purchase. And so if you have any questions on that, maybe that video would be helpful for you to watch, or if you have any questions, you can call me directly and we can go through it. The other thing that we really didn't get to dive too much into, besides the fact that the standard form purchase and sale agreement, the one that your office uses, is pretty good, but kind of talked about the fact that even though it's pretty good, you as agents, your job is clear to write contracts for the offer to be accepted and to grow your business by, lead generating and all those things. In my opinion, I think it's the attorney's job to prepare the purchase and sale agreement and take that work off of your plate. I know that there's some agents that like to prepare it, have that control, which I totally get. But I think more and more and more, especially as attorneys from other areas of the state work in all areas of the state, people are going to see more and more attorneys who want to prepare their own purchase and sale agreements. And it's really for the protection of their client. From just comparing these two, I highlighted a cheat sheet that we use when I train the attorneys who work for me to negotiate a purchase and sale agreement. This is specifically my buyer cheat sheet. So things that we would be adding or making changes to, and pretty much standardized purchase and sale agreements we see from seller attorneys. And as you see, just in first glance, there's quite a bit of this language that we try and negotiate, a lot of red in this section.
Wow.
So, from our perspective, there are lots of things, and it could just literally be adding a word or a phrase that really impacts the protection of either the buyer or the seller. So I think it's really an important thing for the attorney to take the lead on that and to take the work off your plate at the end of the day. If we can do one more thing for you, I think it's, yes.
Which attorney usually prepares the PNS?
Great question. So generally, if the list agent themselves doesn't prepare the standard form, then it's the seller's attorney's responsibility to initiate the first draft. But oftentimes when we get involved as buyer attorneys, where either it's an attorney who, I don't want to call them lazy because it's just the way that they've always conducted themselves, maybe with relationships with brokers who like to prepare their own standard form. So I don't like to call it lazy, but if there is a seller's attorney who essentially just adds a rider to the broker's standard form, then we always, as buyer attorneys, suggest giving us the ability to incorporate those terms into our Word version of the purchase and sale agreement. So that way it's just easier to make any changes, because that's the biggest thing that attorneys dislike about the standardized form, is that in order to make any kind of change, you're basically using the typewriter function in PDF, writing over it with a bunch of X's. It looks sloppy. I like things to look neat and orderly, and whenever you're typing over a generated PDF, it just makes it more confusing for the consumer to review it while they're going through it. Whereas if you have a clean and clear Word document that has the changes already incorporated, it just makes for so just to clarify that point, this is not what the buyer would see. So they wouldn't see all of these changes. They would see it in a final form where it's nice, clear, and concise, and not with writing over it. So I think that it's sort of an important thing to try and, for those of you who maybe were taught to always prepare the standard form purchase and sale agreement, to maybe understand the reason why a lot of attorneys prefer to do it themselves, because it gives them that flexibility to be able to make changes versus either typing over the PDF or attaching an enormously long rider to the purchase and sale agreement that is just as confusing, because then you're going to have to compare, okay, this is referring to paragraph 11. Okay, where's paragraph 11? It's amending one word, and it's just so confusing for the consumer. So from that standpoint, that's why we like to focus or prefer to draft those agreements ourselves. A couple of things that I just like to highlight on this document in particular that I think, especially today, and I'm sure all of you have had maybe people in the office talk about COVID language, especially in our new environment. So I want to highlight this blue section over here. That's a new addition to our purchase and sale agreements due to COVID. And essentially what it does, this is actually the REBA recommended language, and REBA stands for the Real Estate Bar Association in Massachusetts. And so this is language that they've developed that they think is fair for both consumer, the seller, as well as the buyer. And essentially what it does, because in the standard contracts, there really wasn't a clause that we could put this COVID virus under to give either the buyer or the seller an ability to extend the contract. So if you ended up getting a buyer or seller who was not cooperative and wanting to keep the deal together, deals could fall apart. So that's why it's important to have this language incorporated. I don't know whether your office has their own rider to the offer. I've seen some offices. Yeah. I'll ask Sarah about that later. But some offices are incorporating this language into an addendum to be included in the offer when you're submitting it. Others are not. So regardless of whether you have it in your offer or not, attorneys are going to try and incorporate this language. And just so you know, basically just kind of taking you through this section, it gives the ability to extend the closing date due to COVID for 10 business days, just 10 business days, or 90 days, a potential for up to 90 days. So giving that flexibility, more often than not, these kind of extensions were sort of, the timeline was designated because we don't really know when this virus will end. And the preparation of this language was prepared in an environment where we still didn't know what was happening with the registries. several weeks now into this later, a month at least, now we've had a lot of success in keeping closings together because registries are still recording. And so the need for an extension will really only come into play if the need for it is because maybe a financing issue comes up, that perhaps the buyer's on temporary leave and then wasn't able to get a verification of employment, but we know that if we have some more time, they're probably going to get rehired again. So that's why it's important to still have the language, even though we've kind of figured out the actual closing sort of, it has continued to happen, which is great, but it's still an important addition for those types of financing issues. The other thing that this paragraph does is back at the bottom here, and this is the attorney's biggest concern when representing a buyer, is let's say the mortgage contingency date comes. And just to clarify what that means, under the mortgage contingency paragraph, essentially, if the bank, what we're asking for is the bank to provide a commitment letter on or before that specific date. The commitment letter is, Stephen and I know this in particular, all commitment letters are not created equally. So sometimes you have a commitment letter from a large national bank. I'm not going to disparage anybody, but a large national bank where their commitment letter could have 3 pages of conditions on it. Now, that to me, under normal circumstances and not even thinking about COVID, I would always extend that deadline because 3 pages of conditions that are likely not in the buyer's control, to me, is not a firm, unconditional commitment. And that's what we add into our purchase and sale agreement mortgage contingency clause, making sure that if something that's conditioned could be, for example, we see this one a lot, IRS tax transcripts. So essentially what that means is whenever you buy a home, you're going to submit copies of your tax returns. The bank will use this third-party service and basically submit those tax returns to the IRS and say, are these the same tax returns that you have filed? Obviously to prevent fraud, because the bank wants to make sure that the tax return you're giving them is what was actually filed and not somehow amended in some way. So that's a condition that has nothing to do with the buyer. The buyer can't call the IRS and say, hey, where's my tax transcript form? The bank needs it to qualify me. So those are conditions that are not in the buyer's control. And so those are things that we would normally extend a mortgage contingency clause for. But let's say that your deadline comes, your commitment is clear. Essentially, they are good to go. They are approved for their loan. All the conditions that are in third-party controls have been satisfied. In pre-COVID life, the only sort of third-party condition that usually still were listed on commitment letters, but we could not really argue to extend for, was what's called the verification of employment. And what that means is prior to closing, the bank is going to call your client's job and make sure that they're still working. Usually that was done like 3 to 7 days prior to closing. And whenever we were confronted with the seller attorney, they would not allow us really to extend the contingency clause for that because it was deemed to be like a typical condition that you couldn't really extend for. Well, now, post-COVID, if there's a verification of employment and we don't have this added language that the COVID paragraph provides to us, then we're probably going to be trying to extend that contingency date up until closing, because many lenders these days are not only requiring a last verification of employment prior to closing, but the day of, some of them are requiring it. Some of them are requiring a last pay stub to ensure that from the last week, to ensure that your hours didn't go down. So all of those things could affect what looked to be a beautifully clean commitment letter. So if we are in a situation where a couple of our deals right now haven't closed yet, and they were pre-COVID purchase and sale agreements. So they don't have this language. So in those situations, we're trying to extend the commitment deadline up until closing as much as we can. If it's a post-COVID purchase and sale agreement that we got this language added in, we're good, because what the last section here says is if you have a commitment letter, but if the buyer's lender withdraws or terminates the mortgage commitment letter, then the buyer has the right to terminate and still get their deposit back. So even though the commitment contingency has lapsed, you can still, even if it's the day of closing and you lost your job that day, you're able to terminate and get your deposit back. So that's super important for our buyers, because again, it could be out of no fault of their own. Everything's looking great. They work from home, all these things. And then they lost their job. I had a refi. Thankfully, it was just a refinance, but we were literally ready to close. I think it was Tuesday. And on Friday, the client notified the lender that she just lost her job that day. So thankfully, it was just a refi and not a purchase, which would have a lot more implications, because somebody was going to be moving in, someone was going to be selling. So on the buyer front, it's important for your buyers to understand that, to work with an attorney who focuses on real estate so that they are including language such as this. And if you have a seller, it's important for them to understand that this is, unfortunately for them, sort of the way of the world right now. I have a couple of developer clients that we are kind of just talking through this, because usually their offers are rock solid. This particular client, they don't like to accept any kind of condition. So if you are submitting an offer on one of their projects and you have a condo doc provision, they said, no, strike it, read the condo docs before we accept your offer. So they are very, very, they want to make sure that if you're buying, if you have submitted an offer, you're closing. And we had to explain to them, this is the way the world is now. No matter how great an employee is and how great a borrower looks to the lender, this is a new frontier, essentially. So having that expectation set with your sellers is also super important, because obviously if you've had that conversation about that potential issue, if it stings a lot less if a deal falls apart at the end when they knew about it in advance. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great. All right, so this, again, I really just want to touch on COVID and that specific language. Obviously, this whole section here, you're not seeing as many red lines, but this is what we attach to our purchase and sale agreements to protect our buyers. So it's just a lot that we put in to make sure that our clients are as protected as possible. So again, the standard form has its place, but we always obviously would prefer to have the ability to negotiate through a Word document that was drafted by attorneys if possible.
Is it possible to get a copy of your marked up form?
Yeah, I don't see why not.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would like that too.
Mm-hmm.
It helps draw attention to where there are possible changes to a normal P&S would be.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And it'll highlight if attorneys aren't doing these, then you can say, well, Liz would do it, so I can refer her instead.
That's right.
There you go.
All right, so the next document, these are docs that are in your checklist that need to be completed for each file. This is the consent for electronic delivery of documents. Super important. It's one of those things I feel like everybody just does things digitally nowadays, but it's great that your office actually requires you and your clients to sign, or requires your clients to sign this, and requires you to give it to them, because the worst thing that could be is that you assume that clients want to electronically sign documents, but in reality, either they're not reading it because they just figured it was something that they had to do but didn't have any options. So it's definitely something I think it's important, especially for your clients, to understand that this is not a requirement. If they don't want to electronically sign documents, they don't have to. Some clients are like that, But if they do opt for it, make sure that that is signed. I had a client who was actually purchasing a home, kind of like a unfortunate story, really. He is actually closing in about a week and a half, and he had worked with a buyer's agent for a couple, not long. It was like a friend of a friend. She wasn't doing what he expected, so eventually decided to work with someone else. That agent, the original agent, found out that he was under agreement with something, and then demanded my friend agents the fee. The problem for my client and for my client's new agent was that this a exclusive buyer agency agreement was sent to the buyer along with an offer that they had submitted that had gone awry, and the client never knew what they were signing. So they assumed, since everything was sent with the offer, that this was just offer documentation, and they ended up signing an exclusive buyer agency agreement at the same time. So again, you know, you don't want, I don't know the other agent. I don't think it was done necessarily to harm. It could have been, but I really don't think so. I think she just forgot to have it signed and was like, oh wait, I need to do this, and maybe just submitted everything at the same time. So just kind of like a little war story for you to make sure that and he had never signed a consent form for electronic signing. So that's kind of how they were able to wiggle away around they ended up paying, they were going to be paying the original agent a referral fee, but just for good-heartedness. But I think that had that gone to arbitration with the real estate board, they probably would have lost because they didn't have a electronic consent form signed. Any questions about that? Okay. So wire fraud. Another great form. I'm glad your office requires you to have your client sign this. But along with having it signed, so important in your either, not necessarily in your listing presentation, but after your listing presentation, you're going to be hired, or after your buyer agency consult and you're going to be hired, have an actual conversation about wire fraud. It's such a scary thing. And I think that this became heightened like 2 years ago. And so I feel like the pressure of the wire fraud scariness has diminished, but that's the prime opportunity for hackers to pounce when people's defenses are down and not necessarily thinking about it as much as we are, you know, since we have other things on our mind like COVID and staying healthy. But this is, unfortunately, times like that are prime opportunities for hackers and fraudsters to target our industry. Let me give you an example of how scary sometimes this could be. So our office was one of the first, and it's kind of cool because we see now other attorneys' offices literally copied and paste our content into their own form. So it's like, you know, copying is the most sincere form of flattery, and I think it's great. But one of the things that we do in particular that now most offices do is require any person who wants a wire to sign a wire authorization form. And essentially what that will have is all the contact information of the client or the person who's asking, the account number, routing, all that stuff. But then it also includes a callback phone number. So that way, before the wire is even sent, our office will call that person and then verbally verify the information on the wire transfer form. We also require that that form be delivered to us in an original form or sent to us securely, like through a secure email. If it's just emailed to us, we don't accept it. All these types of things obviously can get people frustrated because we have all these little extra layers, but it's for their protection. We actually had a transaction, this was one of mine, where I was representing the buyer. We were going to be wiring the funds to the seller. And after the closing, I get a phone call from someone purporting to be the seller's attorney. Thankfully, I know the seller's attorney very well. I know his voice. Like, we're on 1 million transactions a year with each other. So it wasn't something, thankfully, that I immediately questioned. But I had this person who said, oh, I'm an attorney so-and-so, in a very, very broken English accent. And they were like, well, I'm calling for the callback verification. So they're using the words that they know we are looking for, when in fact the wire authorization form had the actual seller's name, not the attorney's name. And I would never do the callback verification, someone else in my office does. So if somebody was going to be calling to do the verification, they would have been asking for Anna, not for me. So all those things obviously tipped me off that this was, and the fact that the voice was totally not this attorney. But had I been in a rush, had I, not known the attorney, I could have easily been transferred the call to Anna and be like, hey, the attorney's changing up the information. So it's a very scary world, things that you don't ever expect. Another horror story, and again, I tell you these things just so if your clients ever ask, like, oh, how bad could this be? So you have a couple of little stories. We were representing a seller, and our seller was an old school guy. He didn't trust wire transfers, and of course this happens to him. Doesn't trust wire transfers. I want a physical check. I want it overnighted to me. For one reason or another, he didn't want to stop by the office. He wanted it overnighted. So on the final statement, it even collected for a FedEx fee because they knew that we weren't having the check wired. Well, unfortunately, the paralegal gets an email, not from my office, but from someone purporting to be the seller, and says, I want my funds wired now. That paralegal should have, one, not ever, would have instantly questioned it, because when someone's represented by counsel, they're not supposed to be contacting the other law firm because they're represented by counsel. So the first question, or the first instinct, should have been for her to forward that email to me and say, hey, your client's reaching out to me directly. Is this your client? Like, I don't feel comfortable responding to him because you're representing him. She didn't do that. Apparently, what a lot of the banks, national banks, are doing, they have a great sort of fraud prevention programs, and they're able to sometimes flag these accounts and close them. So unfortunately, the paralegal fell for it. She wire transferred funds to this fake account, and the account name wasn't my client. It was some LLC. That should have been tip number 2. But unfortunately, paralegals tend to be overworked. And so she was just trying to catch up and get it done. And she sent it. Thankfully, the bank canceled it because it was a flagged account. And what does this fake seller do? Oh, I'm sorry, why don't you send it to this account? And she does. She sends it to the second account. That account gets flagged. Third time's the charm. The third email with new wiring instructions, all different LLCs every time, and that wire goes through. My client's funds got wired to someone. And until, because the FedEx, it was a Friday closing, so the check was coming on Monday, and the check never came on Monday. It was now 2 banking days, Friday and Saturday, that had passed, so they couldn't reverse the wire. So super scary. Eventually got settled, of course, and my client got fully refunded, but it was just horrible, as you can imagine. So wire fraud is no joke, is the bottom line. And when having them sign this, make sure you have that conversation as well. Questions on that? No? Okay. All right, so this one, the mandatory license disclosure form. So this is required the first personal time you meet for a specific property, you have them included. Generally, it's included with every offer that you submit. So if you are a seller agent or buyer agent, you're checking the appropriate boxes. If you are a seller or buyer agent, you are also required to check the following, either being a non-designated agency, meaning that you're only working for your client and your office is not working for any other party, or a designated agency where the office could have someone who is representing, or the other party's agent is within your office. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
These are super important because I think that for the most part, it's a lot of people get confused as to the differences between designated and non-designated agency, what's good, what's bad. And so it's just important for your clients to understand, if you are a dual agent, what that means. If you are a designated seller or buyer agent and having somebody else in the office who's representing the other side, what that means, and making sure that they feel comfortable with that as well. Okay. Any questions on this form? No? Awesome. All right. So I was actually looking through this earlier.
Excuse me, I have a question. This is something that always bothered me about this form.
The listing,
we talk about
or the or license.
License agreement.
Okay.
I'm at a party, and I'm sure you've heard this before and you know where this is going. I'm at a party and I meet somebody and they see the little R on my lapel and they say, "Oh, Frank, you sell real estate?" I said, "Yes." And they say, "Well, I live at, 122 Main Street and I'm thinking about selling my house. And because I don't carry these forms around with me, what am I supposed to do?" Because it's a face-to-face meeting and we're talking about his property or her property that she wants to sell. How does that work?
Yeah,
I'm sure there's history on this.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wish I knew sort of any kind of case law that came up as a result. I'm going to make a note to myself to see if there is. Actually, I'm going to email myself. Give me a second. But what I would say, just because I'm an overly risk-averse person, I would say in the conversation, hold on one second. I would say, hey, I just want to let you know, could I, obviously if it has to be a lot more of an in-depth conversation, I think, than just, hey, just kind of picking your brain for a second, because you'll want to send this sort of document to them and say, look, and again, I don't think that a lot of people would do this. I'm just a very risk-averse person.
As am I.
So I would say, there's a form that whenever I'm speaking with a client regarding a specific property that I need to sign for my office, would you mind me sending it? I mean, I don't know if a consumer would be like, whoa, we're just talking, very indirectly here about sort of, so I can't imagine someone wanting to take that to court against a broker. But I'm surprised every day. So I will look into it, and I'll let Sarah know so I can send it over to her.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Wouldn't that be more appropriate to produce that document, like when you meet them at the house that they're going to sell or at the house that they're going to buy?
Right. It's just because the language here is like,
that's
kind
exactly
of gray.
Right.
Because it says at the first personal meeting with you to discuss the specific property. So technically one could argue, if they wanted to be, a stickler, well, this is a personal meeting. We're in a meeting together. It's a face-to-face, and we're discussing a specific property. So, I agree. I think that what most people wouldn't consider that kind of conversation that's informal and unprovoked, really, just kind of like a casual conversation, would constitute a first personal meeting. I think that a meeting at one's home would be, but I think the concern is what happens if you have someone who, you know, wants to do you harm, essentially, by trying to provoke you. Well, the thing is,
I mean, you know, it's what's the intent of the regulation that governs this? And you know, no one's going to come, you know, no one would come after you for this, but if something else goes south,
right.
And as an attorney, you know, sometimes attorneys pile on and take a shotgun approach.
Yeah.
And
see what sticks.
say, sure, why not? Hey, you know, that's a flaw. Yeah. That guy didn't know what he was doing. Okay, so thank you.
Yeah. But I agree. I think that generally what would be the most common and the most reasonable interpretation of that language is if that conversation turned into a meeting at the home.
Okay.
But I'm curious now, so I'm going to look it up and send it to Sarah if I see anything.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so the exclusive right to sell listing agreement, the MAR form, you know, there's a lot in here. Have you guys received sort of in your trainings before sort of the nuts and bolts of things to avoid or not avoid? Because in reality, besides just the contractual piece to this and making sure it's completed correctly, and what it actually means in terms of what your duties are, and making sure your client understands what your duties are. I don't know if the office has their specific way of wanting you to incorporate this. And one thing that I wanted to ask Sarah before she headed out is in this, and I'm assuming that if it's something that you have a client who doesn't care or does not want any kind of dual agency or designated agency, you're just crossing this out. I'm assuming that that's just what is recommended by the office, but I wanted to double check with her.
I was told to put in the comments, the additional comments, that it's for this specific home. You know, so like in the additional terms, it was like this agreement, it pertains to the, you know, the address of the home.
Yeah, good. Okay, cool. So in terms of this as well, obviously it's referring back to the disclosure form related to your consumer relationship with the client, making sure that they understand sort of your ethical restraints or restrictions. And just for your own knowledge too, I think what's important to understand as a listing agent, obviously you have a duty to represent your client as best as possible to protect them, but your client still has to do their own due diligence in a sense as well. So, you know, you're not, you know, your client's keeper in every sense of the word. So don't be fearful of that. It's just because they're a consumer and not a realtor doesn't mean that they don't have responsibilities either. But from our perspective, one of the things that we always like to remind brokers of is that even if you're a listing agent and you're not a dual agent, no designated agency, that in the event that you find out information that could make a buyer rethink their willingness to purchase that home, you do have an ethical obligation to disclose that information. The seller doesn't. They have the only disclosures that they must make are for lead paint and septic, Title V. They don't have to disclose anything about the property. So I'm sure all of you have seen the seller's disclosure form. Those forms are 100% optional. There's nothing in this is Massachusetts. I don't practice law in New Hampshire, so this is just Massachusetts. There is no seller obligation to fill out that form. So those are the two things that they really have to disclose about the property. But if you know some hidden thing that would prohibit a reasonable buyer from purchasing the home, you know, you have to ethically disclose that. You, not your client. So your client needs to understand that potential as well. Okay.
Why would a seller fill out the non-disclosure form then?
I don't know. I mean, as a buyer, I like it because then I incorporate that into my purchase and sale agreement that you've provided us this document. And so it doesn't, because most documents and sort of their power expire at the signing of the PNS. So I always try and keep the mention of any seller disclosure form as remaining to be enforceable against the seller. And of course, seller attorneys always try and strike that. I'm like, well, your client gave it, so you're going to give this information and then not try and be liable on what that information says. Obviously, everything is filled out in good faith. And if something's discovered later, it doesn't necessarily mean that the seller's on the hook forever or that they're a horrible person. It could just be that they really had no reason to know. But at the same time, it's for a buyer, it's important to incorporate that language to survive the signing of the PNS, because
does the listing agent have an obligation to show the seller the form or advise the seller one way or the other as to whether or not to sign it?
They don't. Every office is different. So you may have internal protocols that give you the option to produce this and sort of walk your client through this potential option. But I think that some offices prohibit it completely and just don't give their agents the option to use it. Some offices encourage it always on every transaction. You know, I think I always felt that I mean, when I sold my house, I didn't fill one out. Because it's more, for me, again, coming from a lawyer's perspective, I'm putting information out there that even if I'm using good faith to fill it out, what happens if I made a mistake or I misspoke because I totally forgot about something that maybe happened 10 years ago and it was very innocent? Go ahead.
I'm just envisioning a listing agent saying to their client, here's this disclosure form. Look it over, but you don't have to fill it out. And if I'm the client, I'd say, then why are you showing this to me? For the reasons you just stated.
Right. Yeah. I mean, but I also can see certain clients be like, oh, well, yeah, I like to give information to the buyer. Why not? And they're literally just doing it out of the kindness of their heart to try and give the buyers out there some kind of confidence that the house is great and this and that. But then end up, you know, for lack of a better word, screwing themselves because later they, you know, completely blanked on this one thing that now is an issue. I actually have a client now who is super disappointed because although she had a home inspection and everything, the home inspector noticed there was I'm not very technical as it was, you know, related to construction or anything, but there was a repointing of the roof that they had suggested, but the inspector wasn't able to fully see where the exhaust was venting. And apparently it wasn't venting through the chimney, but literally venting right into the attic. So when they were doing the repointing work, all the CO2 detectors went blaring. And now they're, you know, obviously frustrated because they're like, this is something the seller should have known. And had they filled out a document, you know, that's the first place I would have looked to see what did they talk about in terms of any roof, anything. Good for the sellers that they didn't fill one out. But I think that a lot of people do have their sellers fill it out just to be helpful. And again, most people never expect to misstate anything on those forms. So I think there's good and bad, but
as a seller's agent, then you would discourage us from even bringing this up.
I mean, I think it's important to mention it because sometimes clients have received one when they bought and thought that it was a obligation. And so they're like, wait, wasn't I supposed to do something else? Like every human being is so different that I think that it's better to have all the information and say, look, this is a form that's available to you if you wanted to, but this is the reason why I suggest to my clients that it may not be as helpful as it seems like it would be.
What if you don't bring it up and then the buyer would like the disclosure statement?
So if you don't have one and buyer wants one, then they'll have to include that in their offer. And when you're reviewing the offer, you would say, look, this is something that we didn't do because it was not a requirement. They want you to fill one out. Will you accept that provision and fill one out, or we reject that part of the offer and submit a counter offer without that and see if they'll accept?
Well, I mean, you could just fill it out. You could just fill it out and check, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, but you're still, what if you do, but what if you could have not, it's again, that's why I don't like the form.
Well, I've always been under the impression that it was a necessary form.
I was too.
A necessary.
Yes.
Not necessary.
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 Yes. Yeah. And I've always had my sellers fill them out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were told to give them the form and then leave the room. Don't give them any advice. Don't give them any suggestions. Oh, that's no big deal. Don't worry about that. Give them the form and then let them have at it.
And that's New Hampshire or Massachusetts?
Massachusetts.
In Mass. Yeah, because I don't know what New Hampshire requires or not. But I'll talk to Sarah to see sort of, the reason. Maybe, again, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of it's office by office specific. I know some offices, I've talked to agents that are like, what is it? Like new agents, and they download all the documents from MLS and they see a disclosure from I've never seen this. I didn't even know this form existed because their office just doesn't let them use it. Whereas other offices, they encourage it. So, that's why it is an office specific thing. But I'm curious to understand sort of the perspective. Again, I think there's definitely a benefit for buyers who are maybe, shopping around and they get a seller disclosure on this home, but not on another one. So they automatically feel like they're more, they feel more comfortable with this house over a house that doesn't have one. So, I mean, I think there are arguments out there to encourage someone to, but I, again, am just wired a certain way that I get nervous about having it. So I think it's important. I'll talk to Sarah to see what sort of the official word is from the office. But at the same time, I think that so long as you give that whole picture to the client, like these are the reasons why this is good. It may make a buyer feel more comfortable because they may not be getting it from every property. But at the same time, what happens if you misrepresent something that you didn't necessarily mean to? It's something that could potentially pop up later.
Okay.
And I think that's how we've always used when I've noticed it being used, like it was helpful because at the inspection, you'd already really disclosed that, okay, one time they had water in the basement, or, you'd answered
Right.
a lot of those questions. So if anything came up at inspection, you could say to the buyer's agent and the buyer, well, we disclosed that to you in the beginning.
Right. So that's great. Thank you for mentioning that, Stephen, because I think that is super important, because if if that's in MLS already uploaded, you've disclosed the water damage of whatever, or disclosed that the roof is was installed 20 years ago or 30 years, whatever it is, it could potentially eliminate wasted time. So that's another benefit. So again, I think having all those benefits and potential burdens are important. And at the end of the day, it's your client's decision. But I think being able to give those two examples potentially avoiding wasted time because things that you are aware of, you have already told them. So it vets out buyers who, want the perfect home. And it also potentially could make just buyers feel more comfortable. The burden becomes if something's misrepresented or misstated, and it survives the closing potentially, depending on what the contract says.
This was excellent. Thank you.
Great. This, I feel like this is an important form to discuss as well. The buyer agency agreement. So how many of you, I'm assuming the office is encouraging the signing of buyer agency agreements with clients, where I feel like 5 years ago, most offices weren't as encouraging of those types of agreements. I think it's so important. You guys work really, really hard, and it's, it's one of, to me, it's so frustrating when I have agent friends who have been working with someone diligently for a long time, and they hop ship to work directly with the list agent when they don't have a buyer agency agreement signed. And I hate that. So I'm a huge advocate of the buyer agency agreement. And, everyone's kind of conducts this, I'm assuming, in their own way. I've heard of agents who basically, encourage their clients to sign, but say, look, I'm a man, a woman of my word. Like if for something doesn't feel right in the future, we can terminate this earlier, just to make clients feel more comfortable. It's really individuals sort of, every individual is so different in how they handle this. But I think it's also an important thing for you to decide what your success fee is, what they call it, which I think is great. What your percentage should be. And I'm seeing more and more, as I'm sure you've seen, list agents maybe taking 5 or 6% and only giving 2 or 1.5%, and they're keeping 4. I think in recent years, the trend has changed where, when I first started 11 years ago, almost, everything was always 50-50. And now more and more, I'm seeing a lot less going to the buyer agent than to the list agent. And so I think that having that designated success fee, what your percentage is important, because there are a couple of offices out there who really focus on that success fee and make sure their clients understand that if a home is presented that they want to buy, that the commission is less than your success fee, that buyer has to pay the difference. Other people's way that they sell to buyers is, you never have to pay me. This is a service that's free. The seller will pay me. And so they'll accept what the listing agent gives them. So it really just depends on you, the agent, and how you want to conduct your business. But do know that there are agents out there that have their clients sign a buyer exclusive agency agreement. And if they submit an offer, that I had one last week where the commission was only 2%, but they had an agreement for 2.5%. And so the buyer paid 0.5% to their agent at closing. One in particular did a couple of months ago, they did it with negotiating in a seller credit to cover that. So it's not really as much coming out of the buyer's pocket, but through a seller credit. But still, something to think about and ponder. I don't know if your office is pushing that or not, or suggesting it or not, but I just figured I'd mention it.
Is a success fee typically a percentage or a dollar amount?
Yeah, percentage of a purchase price. Usually.
Okay.
Usually.
Because we were taught in one of the sessions I went to on this, you put in a dollar amount, so that way you're guaranteed that amount of money. And if you get more from the listing agent, well, then you get to keep it. And if If it's less, then they have to come up with the difference. Have you heard of that, or is that?
So it's hard because you don't know what kind of, you may have an idea of what your clients can afford. So maybe you can figure out a dollar amount based off of their likely budget. But I feel like it would be difficult and potentially putting yourself in a position where, it depends, because if you overestimate what the purchase price will be so that the dollar amount makes sense. But what happens if you are thinking that your client's going to be buying a $300,000 condo and they fell in love with a $400,000 one, and you put an amount that's less? Obviously, if the commission percentage, the co-broke fee satisfies it, it really doesn't matter. But okay. I feel like a percentage is cleaner. Okay. So that way the expectation is there, and every offer that they're submitting, they have that in the back of their mind.
Okay.
Dollar amount sort of feels very large too. I don't know.
Yeah. It's true. Like, I feel like if you are putting, 15,000 or 20,000, they may be like, whoa, I'm going to be on the hook for this kind of money. Whereas a percentage feels less scary.
Okay.
Nice questions. Thank you. Anything else on anything that we've covered? That's really the bulk of what is in all of your documents, the most important ones that Sarah thought you'd like to talk about.
Okay.
The government didn't, do something for transactions that were leading up to, that had been pre-COVID, but closing during COVID. They're making lots of provisions for rentals or, for tenants, and they're, giving money to, small business owners. And it's too bad that contractually they didn't put something in it, just that this is going to be part of any contract that is currently happening. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's so tough because, with the newest executive order, putting a moratorium on every kind of eviction, so not even emergencies or anything like that, everything stayed, and foreclosures. I think that there's some, obviously there's two sides to every coin, two sides of every argument, but I just work with so many buyers who buy multifamilies, who are living in one unit, renting out the other, and they can't make their mortgage payments without that rent. And whereas a lot of renters believe if you own a multifamily, you're rich. It's really, it's tough. It's a tough pill to swallow. Because you kind of end up being forced in a position that you, as a homeowner of a multifamily, for example, may feel like their only option for you is forbearance, meaning not, coming into an agreement with your lender to stop making your mortgage payments. But that doesn't mean that that money's forgiven. So eventually, not only will you may have lost months of rent, you haven't been able to get them out yet. It'll be once everything starts up again, imagine the docket. And so you could be 6 months to a year without rent. You can't make your mortgage payment. You did a forbearance for that period of time. Now you're behind of your mortgage a year.
You're likely, I've been to the Lawrence courts many times with tenants that we've evicted, and you're not, the chances of even getting that money from somebody at that point has been very, very slim, and
it's lost money. And to catch up for that year, potentially, it's really stressful for a lot of people. I had a deal that literally was between, it was I think an uncle selling to his niece of a 3-family in Haverhill. And the deal was amazing. The niece was getting a gift of equity for the down payment. She had like no money out of pocket. Her interest rate was like 3.1%. It was amazing. But at the end of the day, every tenant, they were going to be occupying one unit. 2 of the tenants had stopped paying. And she was like, even though I have literally no money in the game, like they're paying my down payment through the seller's, gift, I have an amazing interest rate, but I have to let this deal go. Like the deal that probably was the best deal ever, they had to let go because they won't be able to afford that payment. So it's really tough. Yeah, really frustrating for a lot of people out there, but at least we're healthy. Like that's what I keep on telling myself. Any other questions that I can help answer or guide you through?
Nope.
No, this has been great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, thank you all. You have my contact information, I believe, that in the Zoom invites, Sarah's put it, but if not, I'll have her send it. And I'll look into that court case thing about the license disclosure and let you guys know.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Have a
Thanks
great
a lot.
one.
Bye.
Bye.
Peace.